Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, May 27th, 2025, and our friends Scott Ritter and Professor Marandi are back with us. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Scott, let's get started with you. Donald Trump yesterday posted on his social truth talking about Vladimir Putin, and he said that he's absolutely crazy and he feels that Vladimir Putin wants to capture all of Ukraine. And he said that if he goes in that direction, that would be the downfall of Russia. Here is what Keith Kellogg said, addressing what Donald Trump posted.
For this reason, you have to continually apply some type of pressure to the Russians to get them to the table and make a determination on where they want to be. When President Trump spoke with President Putin a little over a week ago, the Russians said they were going to come up with what they call a memorandum. It's what I call a term sheet. What a term sheet means is, okay, this is how we get to peace. We've got that from the Ukrainian side. We need to get that from the Russian side. And then what you do is you meld them together. You put them together. And say, okay, what does this look like? What is not acceptable? What's acceptable? Where can you go to bring it together? And once we do that, once we get their term sheet or memorandum, then we'll put it together, and then there's going to be another meeting, and we believe it'll be probably in Geneva. We would like to have had it in the Vatican, and we were pretty set to do something like that, but the Russians didn't want to go there, to the Vatican. So I think Geneva may be the next stop, and then you eventually go to somewhere where you get all three major leaders of all the parties. You get the President Putin, and President Zelensky together and hammer this thing out and come to some type of signed document that ends this war.
Yeah. Your take, Scott, on what has happened.
Well, a couple of things. Let's just start with the basics. Medinsky, who is the Russian negotiator in Istanbul, has come out and talked about I think it was a comment made by Yermak, who said to Medinsky, "You guys have it easy. You only have one boss. We have three." And first of all, that statement alone makes it clear that Ukraine is not a sovereign state. So we need to stop speaking about a sovereign Ukraine. And therefore, that exposes everything the United States, Keith Kellogg, Trump, the Europeans, NATO is doing as a fraud, because they keep postulating as if Ukraine is a sovereign state capable of making sovereign decisions. Ukraine is not. I did a documentary coming up on 3 years now ago, Agent Zelensky, where I outlined the case that Zelensky was a construct of British intelligence. And he is. I mean, we saw that when he went to Istanbul, how quickly the British dispatched Mr. Powell to be his babysitter, because Zelensky can't be trusted to engage in negotiations without a British handler there to monitor what comes to him and what he says. But the United States is also, the one. Keith Kellogg says the three players are going to come in. I thought Trump was just a guy who was interested in peace. Why now he's a player? That means that there's American interests here, not just Ukrainian and Russian interests. This isn't about melding the two term sheets together. It's about the United States dictating an outcome that's beneficial solely to the United States. There is no Ukrainian position. People need to understand that right now. There's no such thing as a Ukrainian position. There's a NATO position that's parroted by Ukraine, and the United States has played one of these passive roles where they pretend to be sympathetic to Russia, but at the end of the day, they're always gravitating towards the NATO/Ukrainian position. Russia has been consistent from day one. I don't know why Keith Kellogg is confused. I don't know why Donald Trump's confused. I mean, Steve Witkoff has been accurate in portraying the Russian position that has been relayed to him from the very beginning of the U.S.-Russian dialogue. Trump himself got off the phone with Putin, where I think Putin made it pretty clear what the Russian objectives were and how Russia sought to get there and what the Russian conditions are. None of this should take anybody by surprise. Trump, I think, lives in a fantasy world where he believes that he has far more leverage over Russia than he does. I mean, we know that this fantasy is fed by people like Scott Bessent, his Secretary of Treasury, who has said even before he became the Secretary of Treasury that we know the secret of Russia, and the Russians know that we know the secret, and we can break them at any time. There is no secret to Russia. Russia's kicking America's butt. They're kicking NATO's butt. They're kicking Europe's butt. They know the secret of the West, the collective West, and they've solved it a long time ago. It doesn't mean that things are easy for the Russians. None of this has been easy. It's been very bloody. They've suffered numerous casualties, and they have, had to undertake dramatic systemic changes in how they operate to overcome sanctions. But when the sanctions came in, instead of having an economy that went into recession, there was reduced growth, but it stabilized at around 2.2%. Today it's up to 4.8 and growing. How do you do that? How do you strangle the Russian economy and have it grow? Meanwhile, the countries doing the strangling are seeing their Germany's economy is on the verge of collapse. There was just a report today about how bad things are going for the Germans. None of the European economies are doing well. And every time they sanction Russia, it gets worse. This is why Vladimir Putin, who's normally very diplomatic in his use of language, said in a contest of idiots, the European Union comes in second. They're not even good enough to come in first. That's how bad they are. And it's true. Trump, I'm confused sometimes by him because, he has to be better briefed. To give you an example of the stupidity of Donald Trump, and I'm trying to be nice here. I apologize for using that term because I don't want you to get in trouble with your YouTube community. But you can't say that Trump is behaving in an intelligent fashion here. When he does a spontaneous press conference where he calls Vladimir Putin crazy, I don't know what's going through his mind, I don't know what's going on, and on and on and on and on. And then the reporter asks a follow-on question. You are aware that the Ukrainians tried to assassinate Putin. Well, I didn't know that happened. I guess that might have had an impact. No kidding, Mr. President. You who have promised to wipe a certain unnamed nation off the earth if an assassination attempt came in your way. I'm talking about Iran, Mr. Marandi, but I'm not accusing Iran. I'm saying that the president has thrown out those accusations. He says, I would respond drastically. We would annihilate them. We would wipe them out. All right. If that non-existent event causes that kind of emotion, what would you do if you had 500 drones swarm the presidential helicopter trying to kill Vladimir Putin while he was on Russian soil? And the answer is you take out the people that attacked you. But in addition to that, over a course of a couple of days, the Ukrainians launched over 2,000 drones into Russia, 50% of whom were targeted civilian targets, not military targets, civilian targets. What is Russia supposed to do in a situation like that? Russia has responded with overwhelming force against exclusively military targets to the extent that there is civilian damage in Ukraine. It's because Ukrainians have yet to master how to use air defense systems. There's things they have to do to avoid being suppressed by the Russians, which means that they're firing without adequate radar control. So the missiles go dumb and they hit civilian infrastructure. It's exclusively Ukrainian air defense is doing damage to civilian targets. Everybody knows it. The Ukrainians know it. We know it. Everybody knows it. And the last thing I'll say on this is the hypocrisy of Donald Trump, or the stupidity of Donald Trump, is manifest when he claims that America is just sitting there. We don't have any vested interest. Who the hell targeted those drones, Mr. President? Who targeted those drones? Why are you flying U.S. Navy intelligence collection platforms off the Russian coast in the Black Sea? Why? If you're this neutral player, why are American aircraft flying into Poland loaded with military equipment? Because you're not an innocent observer. You're an active participant disguised. You are a wolf in sheep's clothing. And that's the role the United States is playing. Either the president is truly one of the dumbest men in the world, or he's one of the most disingenuous men in the world, or he's both.
Professor Marandi, your take on the situation in Ukraine?
I think the Trump interview was very important, and for the reasons that Scott mentioned. But also I think it reflects on Trump in general, and that he is either not being briefed on key issues, or that they're hiding important truths from Trump, so that they can manage him and push him in a particular direction, or that he is not interested in being briefed, or a combination of both. I'm sure the first part is true. I'm sure that he is being misled. In fact, the point that Scott made about an assassination back when he was the candidate, and where they claimed that Iran was trying to assassinate him, it was clear that the assassination was, the two assassinations that we know of were being carried out by Trump's opponents inside the United States. But they were able to manipulate him, or he was just so immoral that he, for whatever reason, was trying to pin the blame on Iran. But the problem that this creates is that it makes Trump completely unreliable. This notion of strategic uncertainty that Trump speaks about, that's not how the rest of the world sees it, or at least that's not how Iranians see it. They just see this as chaos. They see it as untrustworthiness. One day Trump will say one thing, he'll threaten Iran. The next day he'll say that I want to be great friends, and my only problem is that we don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. Then the next day they move the goalposts and say that they can't have enrichment, which is a sovereign right of Iran. What's happened, what Iranians are witnessing, and it's very interesting, by the way, and I'm not saying that they will not be able to manipulate the markets in Iran in the future, but it's interesting that how when Trump first came to power, every time he said something, it was having a significant impact on Iranian markets. And then gradually that impact declined. And so more recently, when he'd say some outrageous things, either way, positive or minus or negative, like he'd said that, things he recently seemed to be implying that great progress has been made at the nuclear negotiations, didn't have much of an impact on the Iranian market. When he would say that, the opposite more recently, didn't have much of an impact on the market. It sort of shows that people don't take him seriously. And that is, of course, a dangerous thing in itself, because then if a person is not taken seriously, and at some point he wants to be taken serious, whether it's with regards to China or Iran or Russia or internal opponents, then that could create a new host of problems and dangers. So I thought that interview was very revealing, and it also, I think, says a lot about how dangerous the situation could be in the White House for the future of humanity. When Trump does not know, and it seemed that he really didn't know. It seemed like it was spontaneous. When he didn't know that Russia was heavily bombed with up to 2,000 drones, or was in the process of being bombed, and that President Putin's life was potentially at risk. But at the same time, as Scott alluded to, the Americans are deeply involved in targeting. I'm not saying all the strikes and all the drones and all the missiles that are fired are necessarily linked to the United States. But what if people in Moscow believed that the drones that were fired in the direction of President Putin's helicopter were being guided by the Americans? And what if a drone did strike the helicopter? And what if he did get killed? And then senior officials in Moscow would say, well, this American drone is flying over the Red Sea. They're the ones who are what would happen? What would happen as a result? And the same is true with Iran. If the Israeli regime carries out some sort of strike on Iran, we know that they can't carry out an effective strike without the Americans. They need the Americans they need the radar stations in Turkey and in the Persian Gulf, which shows how sovereign Turkey and the Persian Gulf regimes are. But anyway, They also need the Americans to refuel their jets. They are completely dependent on the Americans. Now, forget the fact that they need American ammunition and missiles and funding and that aside. But in order to carry out the operation, they need the Americans. So what if last time wasn't very successful? What if they strike a senior official? What if someone who is very important in Iran is killed or martyred? Then the Iranians blame the Americans for it, because they'll say, well, the Americans were part of this operation. So it seems to me that Trump is not in control. He's not informed. He is sort of indifferent about the dangers of being ill-informed, and he doesn't question why he isn't being informed. Otherwise, if I was Trump and I had not known that a major attack was being carried out on Russian soil, or had been carried out, and that the president of Russia had been threatened, at least there was a minimal threat to his life. If I hadn't been told this, I would have been firing people, all the people involved, on that very same day. So it says a lot about how bad the situation is in Washington, how bad it is in the White House. I'm pretty sure that this has been the case in the past too, with previous presidents, that the deep state, they control what sort of information comes in. But I think in the case of Trump, his lack of interest and his general ignorance is making it even more dangerous.
Scott, the point that Professor Marandi mentioned, I think, is so much important in terms of who's running the show in Ukraine. Because if they could get something with Vladimir, they could hit Vladimir Putin and his team, that could bring some sort of turmoil, international turmoil, to what's going on in Ukraine. Who has the responsibility for the behavior of Ukrainians? Is Europe, Germany, United Kingdom, and France? Or we can link them to the people within the Trump administration. I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I cannot imagine that he knew about it. But some people within the Trump administration.
Let's just start off by stating something that everybody should know is true, but I think we've forgotten about it. The CIA built 20 bases inside Ukraine for the sole purpose of carrying out covert operations targeting Russia. These bases cover a variety of tasks, and we know that the CIA, has integrated Ukraine's covert and overt military capabilities into a strategic objective, which still is valid. Trump has not backed away from or reversed course on the strategic objective of the United States to strategically defeat Russia and Ukraine. And that is also the European and NATO objectives. These have not been reversed. It is still American policy until the president directs otherwise. And the CIA, once given an objective, they don't stop. The connectivity that exists, exists on a number of levels. The CIA is an organization that just specializes in lying to everybody, including themselves. And if you have CIA case officers whose task is to facilitate the effective use of drones against Russian targets, they're going to continue to do that job, and they are continuing to do that job together with their NATO. We know that NATO technicians are working with the Ukrainians to develop their drones, because the Ukrainians have been stupid on their social media to post photographs of people working, and they're going, well, they ain't Ukrainian. We know who they are. They're European, and they're right there next to their Ukrainian counterpart, holding up a guidance system and all this stuff. The attacks against Russia are very sophisticated in terms of applying technology designed to defeat Russian air defense systems. First of all, the drones themselves are constructed of materials that are designed to make them radar resistant. They fly at speeds that are designed to, I'm not going to bore people, but radars have certain sweep. They're looking for things moving at certain paces, and if you have a system that's doesn't reflect and is flying at a given speed, you can make it look like a flock of birds. For instance, if it's flying at the speed of a flock of birds as opposed to faster, the radar systems are tuned to do things. I'm saying it's a very sophisticated approach using, it's not your beautiful stealth drones put together by Americans. They look pretty unsophisticated, but they're designed to penetrate Russian air defense. And they do so by exploiting seams in the Russian air defense. I don't know what the frequency of Russia's shuffling the deck is. I know as somebody who has, planned and participated in sophisticated warfare that, we just don't leave our air defense system sitting in one place so that the enemy can say, oh, there's the umbrella. We move them around consistently so that we have different umbrellas that make it difficult for people to plan attacks because the attacks are designed to split the seams of air defense. And if you take a look at the drone flights, the way they fly into Russia, they fly at specific altitudes, they fly in specific directions, they change altitudes as they go, flying slow with radar absorbent material. This is a very sophisticated attack, and it's also designed to come in waves. Again, I won't get into the planning details of why you do that. The Iranians know because they hit the Israelis with waves, so they understand the benefit of saturation, and then rebound time. And if you come in, you can hit a number of gaps at the same time and exploit them. This is what the Ukrainians are doing. This is beyond the capability of Ukraine. This is stuff that's brought into Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are schooled on this and are executed. So it's a Western attack against Ukraine. I don't think the United States has an overt role in this. We've tried to pull back, but the CIA is there. I can guarantee you there's CIA fingerprints all over this because that's what they do. And the CIA never stops. They never stop. They don't take orders from the United States president. They take the initial order from the United States president, but then the CIA goes off and they do what they do. Look at Iraq. There was a period of time when the CIA was working with the Kurds in the north to try and, foment problems, to create issues. And around 1993, I guess, 93, 94, there was a CIA operative, Bob Baer, who was there, and he had received, he thought his instructions were to use the Kurds to create instability for Saddam, and he received word from I guess it was the PUK, that the Talibanese people, that the Iranians wanted to help, and he was told, you can't meet with the Iranians and stand down. And Bobby Bear didn't stand down. Now, he has his version of events, but the bottom line is the Kurds launched an attack against the Iraqis, expecting America to be there for them, and we weren't, because the CIA lied to them, promised support that didn't manifest itself, because the CIA could never hit the off button. And right now in Iraq, we had 20 CIA bases doing weird stuff, unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, drone warfare, electronic warfare, running covert agents, planting caches inside Russia of explosives that would be drawn upon by Ukrainian assets to blow things up. CIA does it all, baby. And that's what they did. And that's what they're doing. And they're deeply involved. The president may not know about this because, to be honest, the director of the CIA may not know about it. And Tulsi Gabbard certainly doesn't know about it. The man running Russia House may have an inkling of it. But the bottom line is there's some senior case officers down there saying, don't worry about it, boss. We got it under control. And they just keep going. Look, the CIA trains its case officers to lie to the polygraph. Their own polygraph, the one that's supposed to check whether or not they're alcoholics, wife beaters, traitors, and all this. The polygrapher knows. They're like, you ready? And they do the polygraph, and they select, because they're all liars, because they're all drunks. They all cheat on their expense reports. They're not good people. We call these case officers American heroes. No, they're not. They're criminals and they're thugs who are running covert operations without the consent of their government. And in this case, these are covert operations which put the life of the Russian president at risk. Now, I don't know how Russia operates, but I can guarantee you this. A foreign power kills the American president, and we are in an existential phase of our interaction with the world. There's a reason why we have nuclear weapons. And one of the reasons is you don't get to kill our president. No one. I'm not making a threat against any nation. I'm just stating a statement of fact. You kill the American president, your nation ceases to exist. In fact, many nations will cease to exist because we will make assumptions that all of our potential enemies are involved. We assume that if you're killing our president, you're trying to decapitate the leadership to destroy the country. Well, gosh, if we feel that way, how do you think the Russians feel? How do you think the Iranians feel? I think Professor Marandi is a lot less aggressive than I am, but I think he was saying the same thing, that if you attack Iran and kill a senior Iranian leader, the Iranians have a right to assume that that wasn't an accident and that there's intent behind that action. The intent is not necessarily to allow Iran to thrive as a nation state, but the opposite. And Iran will respond accordingly, as they should, as any nation should, if another nation carries out, decapitation of the senior executive. But no, the United States is involved in everything that's happening in Ukraine because, as I said early on, Medinsky, Yermak told this to Medinsky. There's three bosses. Ukraine's not a sovereign state. These actions by Ukraine against Russia are not the actions of Ukrainian sovereignty. They're the actions of Ukraine being a proxy of its true masters who reside in Brussels, in the Washington, D.C., in the various capital cities, especially London. London is extremely influential on what the Ukrainians are doing.
Professor Marandi, what Scott mentioned is about the role of CIA and the security of that region. We know that Iran, together with UAE and North Korea and Russia, will attend a high-level security and intelligence briefing in Moscow, which will be attended by Putin's top secret aide. What is the main concern of these countries coming together to talk about their security?
I don't know the details about this, and I've just read this online, so we'll have to wait and see. But one thing that I'd like to add to what Scott was saying, and maybe that would be indirectly related to the question, is that the Iranians know how the Americans work very well. In some ways, I can argue probably better than any other country in the world. And the reason is that the Americans had two long-standing occupations, and they still do to a degree in Iraq, that are on both sides of Iran. The Americans occupied Afghanistan for 2 decades, and Iraq, of course, in a way, it still continues. And so ever since the Americans entered this country, the Iranians began to counter the Americans in their own way. The Taliban, without Iran, would not have been able to expel the Americans. Iran has deep differences with the Taliban. They're very hostile towards women. They don't let them go to school. There are many differences that Iran has with them. But for the Iranians, they're still indigenous. And the American threat was always paramount. So Iran knew how embassies worked, and to be very blunt, the Americans were very corrupt. I mean, I'm not involved in these things, but I do meet people in different circles, and I have over the years, how easy it was for the Iranians to purchase helicopter engines at a very cheap price from American bases in Afghanistan, or how the Iranians could get all sorts of intelligence from American diplomats and others over coffee, not through their own people, but through Iraqis in Baghdad. So you had this huge American presence, the CIA, the military, the diplomats. And it's very corrupt, and the most corrupt of them all is U.S. intelligence. And this is extremely dangerous under normal circumstances for any government. And to a degree, I have to point out that intelligence agencies are the most difficult to manage by any country, because in order to protect the country's intelligence, they are in small cells. They are separated from one another. Inside intelligence agencies, the different groups don't know much about one another. Because if someone, let's say if some American CIA agent defected to Iran or to Russia or to China or to India or to anyone else, then they would be able to expose all sorts of information about different parts of their organization, and that would be catastrophic. So what intelligence agencies do is they try to compartmentalize the different parts. They try to keep the different people and different groups separate from one another. So if something does happen, or if someone is arrested or captured, or if someone defects, the damage done to that agency is minimal. But that makes it difficult to control what goes on in an agency, because even the person who's the head of the agency doesn't necessarily know what's going on beneath it. So that is an issue that all major intelligence agencies have, and a problem. So there's always this possibility that people go rogue, and we've had that in Iran before, by the way, where agents have gone rogue. But in this case, you have the CIA, which is very corrupt. I mean, Iranian intelligence agencies, I think, I would argue, are pretty clean. But the CIA, because of its very long history and its global interference and the sheer amount of money that goes into the agency, and of course, how it made money through the drug trade, whether in Vietnam or in Latin America or in Afghanistan, very corrupt. Now you have a president, any US president has to control the CIA. I think it's impossible to control it because of the nature of the CIA. But in the case of Trump, someone who doesn't even know what we know from the internet about a major strike on Russia, which is one of his most three important foreign policy issues, and he doesn't know that President Putin's helicopter was at risk. I think such a president has no clue about what the CIA is doing. And so I would imagine that in any engagement between Iran, Russia, and others, North Koreans, the Chinese, anyone, the Emirates, I don't know exactly why the Emirates would be in such a meeting with the North Koreans and Iranians. I have no idea, and I don't know. That's why I'm curious to know if this is really true or not. But I personally, I doubt it, but I may be wrong. So it may turn out to be something that's really happening. But the point is that in any meeting, I would imagine between serious agencies, one of the key questions is, what is the CIA doing, and do the people at the top know that this is happening? And again, this goes back to what we were discussing earlier. This just makes the global situation all the more dangerous. Because if this is not US policy, because we all assume, I mean, in general, I would assume that every major event that takes place in my part of the world, or in Eastern Europe, or in the South China Sea, is based upon a policy that is approved by the US president. But what if things are happening, important things are happening, that are not approved by the US president? And the United States is the global hegemon. It has 700, 800 bases across the world. And so you have all these agencies, all these the CIA, among others, involved everywhere. It's not like Iran is a major power. Iran is the most important power, I would argue, in West Asia. But Iran's realm of influence is West Asia. The U.S. president, even if he's a brilliant genius, controlling this empire is I think impossible, and that's why it's been declining so fast. But the point is that it makes this all the more dangerous, because everyone would assume that the U.S. government is intentionally being provocative or carrying out a particular policy, and it may be that Trump or the president doesn't know. Let me give you an example. During Trump's first presidency, the U.S. flew a drone over Iranian airspace, and the Iranians brought it down. Back then, it was my assumption that Trump knew about this, that they were intentionally being provocative. They had a policy to do this, to probe Iranian air defenses. Now, when I think about it, I don't know. Maybe he had no idea that this was being done. Maybe the head of CENTCOM was doing it without authorization. Maybe someone, in the CIA was pushing for this sort of operation. The Iranians, of course, reacted because it flew over their airspace. They brought it down. And so if it could have led to a war. But we don't know. Did Trump know what was happening, or was this just the system doing what it does? So the CIA is, I believe, the most dangerous organization on this planet, which could lead to the world to a third world war, simply because it is answerable to no one, and its funding is endless.
Can I just add just two things to illustrate this? The CIA worked with Israel to develop a computer virus known as Stuxnet. It was a joint operation, and then the Obama administration gave orders not to deploy because they had some concerns about the containability of this. And yet it was deployed. Now it was interesting because when it first came out, and it impacts Siemens. I forget the term, but the sort of the controllers. And in the United States and around the world, people started detecting this anomaly. And there was a meeting in the White House Situation Room where the Homeland Security chief was saying, we're under attack. And he's described the Stuxnet. He says, America's under attack. And Biden and Obama couldn't say anything because they knew that this was their attack against Iran that went wild. But the CIA knew about it because the CIA, even though Obama said don't do it, maintained the connectivity and helped facilitate this attack. This is an attack that it was very dangerous and very disruptive globally. Shows the irresponsibility of the CIA, because even when the president is briefed and says, that's a little too risky, we don't want to do this, we don't want it, we thought it could be contained, but it got out. It didn't. And then I'll give you another example from my own background. I went to the Philippines in 1986, I think the fall of Marcos, about that time. And I took in a Marine Corps platoon to reinforce the garrison because there was concerns about the New People's Army making a move. And one of the things that I have to do is, when the decision was made to let the Marines go on liberty, because the first half of the deployment, they weren't allowed off the post, but the Navy continued to do it, so the Marines were going to revolt. So we had to let them off the post because the Philippines, of course, is, adult playland for the idiot Marines. But now the question is, they're going to go out there, they're going to get drunk, they're going to frequent houses of ill repute, and Marines can get in trouble. So my job was to go out to the Philippine constabulary and ensure that if one of my Marines got in trouble, I got a 24-hour head start to get them all out of the Philippines before they put what's called a legal hold on them. So I went into a negotiation with this guy to say, we need this to happen. And he said, okay, because apparently he's done this before. He said, go speak to a captain, and he gave me the name of an Air Force OSI, Office of Special Investigations officer. And I said, well, that's strange. Why am I going to go speak to that? I went to him and he said, yeah, okay. Go down to the pistol range here. And he wrote me out a receipt. He said, get a box of spent 45 caliber barrels. You know, when we shoot our M1911s, when the barrels go bad, we throw the barrels into a box and get a new barrel on them. And there's a box of old barrels. And he said, yeah, take that and go deliver it to the head of the Philippine Constabulary, and you'll be good. The deal will be made. And I said, well, this is a very strange thing to do. He said, no, it's okay. And so I did it. But then I started asking questions because I'm like, why am I giving this guy spent barrels? Well, the answer is, this is an old CIA-backed program of political assassinations. The spent barrel is put into the weapon used to kill somebody, to murder somebody, and then you just change the barrel out, and then the rifle on the barrel won't match the slug taken out of the head. That spent barrel is disposed of and never seen again. So each barrel, I must have given the guy 55 barrels. That's 55 dead people. And it's a CIA program that began in 1969, 1970 to help the Filipinos suppress the New People's Army. I, being the naive lieutenant that I was, reported up the chain of command. And what I was told is, don't talk about it anymore, but it's going to go away. What I had done is stumbled upon a program of political assassination supported by the CIA that was supposed to have come to an end in the mid-1970s. During the Church Commission and all this kind of stuff, and supposedly the orders went out, but things remain on automatic. That's the problem with intelligence and nefarious deeds that are operating underneath the shadows. When you try to get rid of them, you don't know the scope and scale of them, and you don't know how to turn them off, and they just keep going and they keep going and they keep going. And I mean, that's just the reality. It's a mess today. Our intelligence community is an absolute mess. It's so corrupt that we don't get good intelligence anymore. I'll just tell you right, we don't get any good intelligence about Russia anymore. And I would imagine that the Iranians, there was a time when we had the Iranian nation penetrated fully during the Shah. But the revolution made it difficult. And it's become even more difficult because the Iranians have been very effective over the years in knowing patterns. The CIA is not very good about developing new patterns of behavior. And once you figure out a known pattern of behavior, certain things come obvious. For instance, I think the Iranians found out about the use of a Munich dead letter drop or something like that, where Iranian stay-behind agents would send letters to Munich, to a post office box in Munich, and that was their covert communications with the CIA. It ran the Iranian desk in Munich, and apparently the Steve Ritter, I think his name was, who screwed up Iraq. He screwed up Iran too, but he sent out the order once, I need extra reporting from Iran. And they're like, well, boss, the way we do it right now is every now and then on infrequent basis, they send a letter and no, insist that they, and next thing you know, all these letters are going to Munich, and the Iranians go, I wonder why that is. And they reverse engineered each letter. And next thing you know, what was left of the CIA's network in Iran wasn't alive anymore, or wasn't in existence anymore. The CIA is not very good. They're really not very good at what they do. Every once in a while, they come up with a gem, a little thing, but as a systemic approach to intelligence collection, the CIA is easily manipulated. They've been run out of China. They've been run out of Russia. They've been run out of Iran. Those are our three top targets, that and North Korea. And if we don't know what the hell's going on, then we start making stuff up. And that's the other danger, is that you get analysts who, again, I can understand we can't operate in Iran. But my God, if I were the director of the CIA, I would recruit so many people just to attend conferences and go and meet Iranians. Not necessarily, I wouldn't give them any tasking. I'd just say, meet people, talk to people, come back and let me talk to you. Let me get a feel for Iran. Let me get an idea of what's going on in Iran. So that when I read something, I can go, well, that doesn't sort of make any sense because I've been told this, that, and the other thing. And now this is happening. It's a red flag. But we have people who are so stupid that they hallucinate what's happening in Iran without any real. You try and get a person to talk to you about the Guardian Council, the Assembly of Experts, the Expediency Discernment Committee, talk about the Supreme National Security Council. I mean, all these bodies there, all they say is that, it's a dictatorial regime run by the supreme leader that responds to his everything, and the president has no power or influence. And I'm like, I understand it's a theocracy, and I understand on questions of Islam, the supreme leader is supreme. But Iran's a little bit more complicated than that, guys. I think there's a constitution that they actually care about. And I think that if you study all these things, you'll find out that Iran is the role of the Majlis, the parliament. You can't dismiss it. It's real. They have influence. They don't direct things, but when was the last time? And you're smiling, so either I'm getting this very wrong or I'm on to something.
No.
But the point is, we don't understand Iran. We don't understand how it works, and we don't want to understand because we like to live in our ignorance, because our ignorance empowers the corrupt intelligence community. The same thing with China. The Chinese ran us out a long time ago. We have no idea how China works. With Russia, I can sit down with the CIA's top Russia person today, and I can guarantee you within 30 minutes, I will expose the fact that they have no clue how Russia works, that they operate in very simplistic, Putin directs, Putin does this. They don't talk about the fact that he has to meet with committees, he meets with groups, organizations, that a lot of the policy is from the bottom up, that Putin is a manager, not a director. This is the reality. We just don't understand the world we live in. And if we don't understand, how can we talk about a solution with the Iranian nuclear program? The Iranians today, maybe I'm getting ahead of your question, Nima, but the Iranians today are saying, we think there could be a deal, but it has to respect our sovereign right of enrichment. Now, if you had smart people in the United States, we'd go, guys, the door is opened for a deal here. Let's get the deal. If we want to stop this nuclear weapon possibility, right here, this is what we can work with. But instead, you have idiots go, the Iranians are weak. They're caving in. We can go for absolute zero, no enrichment. That's our position. And the president's going, yeah, no enrichment, zero. But where's the smart person going, boss, that ain't never going to happen. That is not going to happen. You will never get the Iranians to go to zero, because this is not just their sovereign thing. This is their intellectual legacy. They've put their national reputation on the line here. The fact that the Iranians are willing to, and I don't know, the foreign minister is saying that it's very complicated discussions. So the implication there is there's some weird stuff being put on the table that all parties are looking at, but they're very complicated. I saw one, they talked about American inspectors in Iran. I'm like, that would be weird. That would be different. But who knows what they're talking about? I don't know. But the fact is, I will tell you this. If Iran is willing to consider American inspectors inside Iran to verify whatever agreement they come up with, that means Iran is committed to the path of peace, because that is such a huge departure from what their approach had been in the past. American inspectors weren't allowed on the IAEA teams that went in under the safeguards agreement, because Iran doesn't trust the American inspectors. And then I'll leave it at this. We come back to what Professor Marandi said earlier. Every time Donald Trump opens his mouth about Russia, he undermines the Iranian negotiations. Because let's hypothetically say that the Iranians were willing to consider the possibility of American inspectors in Iran monitoring this deal. That's going to be based upon an agreement that has four corners that are to be respected, and it's supposed to be sustainable. That means it should be captured in a treaty form. But every time Trump opens his mouth, not only does it cause the Iranians to question what's going to happen when the next president comes in, but what's going to happen when Donald Trump wakes up the next morning and has constipation, is sitting on the toilet reading his Twitter feed, and Keith Kellogg's tweet comes up, somebody's tweet, the Israel tweet comes up and says, Iran can't be trusted up. No, I know we agreed on this, but no. Now we have to go this way. And the Iranians are like, but we just spent weeks, if not months, hammering out a deal. And now you, because you were constipated and read a bad tweet, decided you didn't want to do it. And I don't mean to be crude here, but this is literally how this presidency works. This is not about policy that is discussed and worked its way up. This is about a narcissist who makes a unilateral decision, demands that people act on it. people work very hard to get it done, and then he decides on a whim he didn't want to do that. How can you negotiate with that? And that's a fair question. How can you negotiate with someone like that? And the answer is you can't.
Professor Marandi, many people in the West don't know what is the involvement of Iranian nuclear program in various branches of the government, of the society in Iran, in terms of healthcare, agriculture, industry, and you name it. Can you provide us with some sort of information on how deeply the Iranian nuclear program is important for Iran in various types of, various branches of science, together with the way that they're helping the society?
Well, I think it's important to first keep in mind that initially Iran had the Tehran experimental reactor function with very highly enriched uranium, weapons grade uranium, and this was during the Shah's time. So the enriched uranium back then was weapons grade, whereas after the revolution, when Iran has been producing its own enriched uranium, it has never enriched uranium to that degree of purity. The Iranians have enriched uranium at 3 levels, and then I'll respond to your question later. One is at a bit above 3%, which is for civilian nuclear reactors. Why is Iran enriching uranium? Does it want to enrich uranium at these levels? Because Iran is a sanctioned country. And if Iran develops a number of nuclear reactors to produce electricity and also to produce sweet water, because Iran has a big shortage of water that for different cities, and we've had a drought over the last few years. So one of the Iranian responses is to build nuclear reactors for desalination and for electricity. So if Iran creates these power plants, and they're very expensive, nuclear power plants are very expensive. The electricity is cheap, but building the reactor is expensive. So if Iran builds these reactors and then they're blocked from obtaining fuel, then it will create an economic crisis and huge shortages across the country. So why would Iran be worried about fuel? First of all, because the United States sanctions Iran. Iran is under maximum pressure sanctions. But also we have a history in that during a period of time, during the Khatami years and the, I think, first couple of years of the Ahmadinejad administration, or the first term, Iran was slow to build refineries for gasoline. And for a period of time, Iran began to become dependent on imported gasoline, even though it exports oil and petrochemicals, but there was a shortage of gasoline and Iran was purchasing it from abroad. The Americans decided to block Iran from importing gasoline. That would have created a massive economic problem in the country. So the Iranians immediately went to work and created refineries, or used parts of their petrochemical plants to make gasoline in the short term in order to prevent the country from being at risk. So when the United States is capable of weaponizing gasoline, it can obviously weaponize enriched uranium. So Iran needs the capability. And also Iran was an owner of a French, Iran had shares in a French company that enriched uranium. And Iran was removed after the revolution from that company. In other words, Iran's shares were sold and it was expelled. So Iran knew that it had to be independent of the West and it had to have its own capability to enrich uranium. The enriched uranium that is now used at the Tehran experimental reactor is uranium that's enriched at 20%. So before the revolution, it was enriched at over 90%. Then they changed it so that it could use uranium at 20%. The Americans also blocked Iran from importing fuel rods for the experimental reactor. That experimental reactor produces medical isotopes for cancer patients. That's one of the uses. So when the Americans blocked this, the Iranians began to enrich uranium. It's a long story, and I'm summarizing it. The Iranians ultimately produce enriched uranium at 20%, which is a very sophisticated process, and I know nothing about it. But enriching it's from going from 3.6% to 20% is a very complicated process, and the Americans didn't think that the Iranians could do it, and they did it. And then the Americans murdered the scientist who was behind the project. So, and the Israelis, because all the assassinations were basically joint projects. The Israelis, they need the Americans for everything. But in any case, they enrich uranium at 20%. Now, we know that Iran enriches uranium at 60%, whereas it doesn't really need it. But that is basically for leverage. And I said this publicly when the negotiations were taking place in Vienna, that the Americans are imposing maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. So Iran went and produced uranium at a higher degree to put pressure on the Americans to come to the negotiating table to have a deal. And that shows that the Iranians, during President Raisi's period, were serious about having a deal. They were enriching that uranium so that they can come to the negotiating table with the Americans and say, okay, back off, stop strangling ordinary people, and this is one thing that we can give up. But in any case, the nuclear program is used for agriculture, it's used for industry, it's used for cancer patients, it's used for medicine, it's used for electricity, it's used for, as I said, desalination. It has many uses. And one of the important uses is that if Iran produces more plants to produce electricity, then they can export more oil, because Iran's oil consumption is through the roof. Gasoline, and this is a big issue in Iran right now. Gasoline in Iran is, I think, roughly 1 cent a liter. 1 cent a liter, 4 cents a gallon. That's I'm sure that to your viewers sounds like paradise, but imagine the amount of money the government has to put into this. In other countries, they make money off of the gasoline through taxes. In Iran, they're paying for people to go on vacation. They're paying for people to go and buy to the local grocery to buy bread or whatever it is that we do on a daily basis. And it also, when it's so cheap, it encourages people to just waste gasoline, to do unnecessary things with their cars, and it also does not create an incentive for the automobile industry to clean up. But in any case, the nuclear program, all of this aside, it is sovereignty. It is sovereignty. It is a part, Iran's right within the framework of the NPT to have a peaceful nuclear program and to enrich uranium. And that's why the Iranians will not give it up, because the revolution in Iran was very much about sovereignty, dignity, honor, which is something that's specifically powerful in Shia culture because of the grandson of the Prophet and Karbala. And so, dignity, honor, independence, these are very powerful themes. Social justice, these are very powerful themes in Iran. Actually, here in Venezuela, I'm here for the elections. When I speak to Venezuelans and how the debates over social justice, they're very fascinated, because they never knew that, like, in Iran, these themes, the theme of social justice, how powerful it is, and they see how strong the similarities are between their culture, their political culture, and what we have in Iran in certain ways. But this is not something that the Iranians can give up. And if, as Scott pointed out, the Americans really understood Iran, they would know that this is not the way forward. It's a waste of time, and it's also dangerous. So the Americans, I remember in the previous Trump presidency, he put pressure on President Erdogan to to release a preacher, a pastor. And I didn't think that Turkey would do that. And all he did was just put on some sanctions, or the threat of sanctions, and Erdogan kneeled. That would be impossible in Iran. That would be absolutely impossible for such a thing to happen. If they wanted a solution, the Americans, with Iran, they'd have to go about and do it in a different way, a much more complicated way, and give concessions to Iran, make sure they would have to make it very clear to everyone that Iran was not weak, or that Iran was not giving concessions. But since they don't have those experts, as Scott says, they just deal it with, okay, we threaten countries, just like the language that Trump used with regards to Putin. You don't talk that way to a world leader. And even Trump's opponents, who would use every opportunity to humiliate him, the liberals, the CNN, the people at the New York Times, the Washington Post, they would ridicule him on anything that he says, any stupid statement that he says. But when he makes a dangerous statement like this, which is stupid, no one protests, because that is okay. That is okay. And that shows the degree of ignorance in the United States about the consequences of this sort of behavior. This exceptionalist culture that exists, I think, more in Washington than in other parts of the United States. I think many Americans are seeing that the United States is not that exceptional. We see the student protests. We see how people are turning against the Israeli regime. They see the immorality of U.S. policies. Young people, many people, older people, they see through the facade. But among elites, this exceptionalism makes them pursue policies in a particular way. So insulting President Putin like this, or anyone else, the Iranian leader, or President Xi, or any other leader, is acceptable. And that is very dangerous. And that is partially because of that exceptionalism, and partially because of the ignorance that exists in Washington about the abroad. The intelligence agencies aren't just there to take the secrets of other countries. They're there to tell them, look, this is how these societies work. This is what the reality is outside of those embassy walls, where the diplomats are sitting there among themselves day and night, and very rarely do they go out. And if they do, they're usually meeting diplomats who themselves are behind their own embassy walls. These are the people who are supposed to know what's going on, and they don't. And then what does the United States rely on? They rely, when it comes to Iran, Chinese, the Russians, they rely on these Iranians who will say what needs to be said in order to get their money. They know what the narrative is, so they'll repeat that narrative. And then the Americans, the CIA, and other agencies fund those Iranians. And then those Iranians go and fund congressmen, congresswomen, senators to come to their programs to say what needs to be said. So the Americans are paying their own politicians to say things like to speak out against Iran, Russians, Chinese, others. And then they believe their own propaganda. They're paying for the propaganda. There's this story. There's a person called Mullah Nasruddin in Iranian culture, right? So Mullah Nasruddin goes out and creates this rumor, and maybe the story may be wrong, but I think it's more or less correct. Mullah Nasruddin goes and spreads this rumor in town that they're giving ash, or a form of soup, somewhere for free. And so all the people of the town, or many people in town, go to that place and they stand in queue waiting for their soup. The soup, the rumor, and he created the rumor. So, but then some people who know him well and know what he did see him standing in queue or in the line, and they ask him, "Why are you standing in this line? You made this rumor. There is no soup or ash." And he says, "I know, but what if there is soup? What if actually they're giving this?" So the Americans, they repeat these lies so much that they come to believe it. And if any, I don't watch satellite. I don't watch television very often. I haven't for 20, 30 years. But I usually, what I watch is I watch it online if someone sends me a clip or something. But what I've seen in hotels, on CNN or the BBC, these are people. I mean, it's pretty similar to what I think the CIA is like. These are people, you see, like these panel discussions on Iran. They're all the same people. One says, let's bomb them. The other one says, let's sanction them. The other one says, they're evil, but we have to talk to them. It's basically an echo chamber. And that is, I think, how the elites in Washington, whether it's the CIA, whether it's the State Department, whether it's the media, that is how they function. And that's how they see the world beyond. And I think that the way in which, again, Trump spoke about Putin, President Putin, and how there was no negative consequences for that sort of language and behavior, I think that itself is pretty revealing.
Scott, I want to change the direction of the talk to what's going on in the Middle East, in Gaza. Here is what we learned from the conservative leader Kemi Badenoch in the United Kingdom, the way that she's picturing the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza and the Palestinians.
Support the current Israeli action, and that actually you think that Mr. Netanyahu's language on this is justified.
I'm not here to police the language of the Prime Minister
I'm not
of
asking
Israel.
you to police it. I'm asking
what he has said. He sees
people
this.
need to know where you stand.
Yeah, but I've been very clear where I stand. Hamas is a terrorist group. They are not our friends.
I'm talking about what
Trevor,
you think about the Israelis'
Yes, but it's all related. Who funds Hamas? Iran, an enemy of this country. An enemy of this country. Israel is fighting a proxy war on behalf of the UK, just like Ukraine is on behalf of the Western Europe against Russia. We have to get serious. We have to get serious. There was a terrorist plot in London against the Israeli embassy. We saw 2 Jewish members of the Israeli embassy in DC killed. Whose side are we on? We need to make sure that the hostages are returned. No one wants to see a war in Gaza. Palestinians are suffering. Netanyahu is complaining that he thinks our leaders are carrying out the wrong action. He has every right to say that. What I want to see is Keir Starmer making sure that he is on the right side of British national interest. That cannot be on the side of Hamas.
Yeah. Scott, the way that she's picturing that is a proxy war on behalf of the United Kingdom. What do you make of it?
You mean that Israel's waging a proxy war on behalf of the United Kingdom against terrorists?
She literally said that they're fighting a proxy war on behalf of the United Kingdom. I
think she also said that Hamas is a proxy of Iran, and that everything Hamas is doing is because the Iranians are directing them to do it for the benefit of Iran. What's left out of there is fact and history. This conflict didn't begin on October 7th. October 7th represented a new phase of the conflict. But this conflict began, this conflict began with a guy named Theodore Herzl thought it was a good idea to exploit British imperialists to create a Jewish homeland in the territory known as Palestine so that it could serve as an outpost of British imperialism. He wrote about it. He said so. This is what his goal and objective was. And the British acted on it, Balfour's Declaration. And we ended up having this artificial entity created in the Middle East, which today we call Israel. Now, Herzl didn't predict World War II. He didn't predict the Holocaust, and he couldn't understand the political forces that were behind the concept of providing a homeland for Jews in the aftermath of the Second World War, where they wouldn't be, subjected to European genocide. But at the end of the day, the state of Israel was created for better or for worse. I'm somebody who says, and I've said this before, regardless of what you think about the creation of the state of Israel, the United Nations created the state of Israel, and therefore the state of Israel exists. And until the United Nations decides that the state of Israel shouldn't exist, it will exist, unless it morphs into something that's unsupportable and unsustainable. And that's the case today. The Israelis started right off the bat being dishonest brokers, 1947, 1948, the Nakba, where they weren't satisfied with what the United Nations gave them, and they sought to seize more. This was a part of a plan that had been going on for years. So the Israelis never negotiated in good faith with the people who eventually became the Israelis. They've always been seeking to exterminate, either through deadly force or through eviction, the legitimate population of Palestine. And Gaza became an open-air concentration camp. And the West Bank became a zone of occupation, especially after the Six-Day War, 1967, where the Israelis occupied it. And then since that time, the Israelis have been doing their best to strangle those Palestinians into non-existence while containing, constraining, and killing the people of Gaza. So, this lady doesn't exist in reality. She doesn't understand the reality of what's going on. When you have a government, look, I've always spoken out in defense of Yitzhak Rabin, not because his policies were perfect, far from it. And I've been somebody who has been educated. Look, I don't claim to know everything about anything, and I'm always willing to be educated about complex issues, especially the issue of Israel's policies toward the Palestinians. I came into this by working very closely with Israeli intelligence from 1994 to 1998. I traveled to Israel numerous times, met with very senior people, and I developed an affinity for the Israeli people and the Israeli cause. It was an affinity based upon incomplete information, but at the time that I was in Israel, every time I went there, a Hamas terrorist bomb went off, killing innocent people. And that will color your opinion, especially if you ate at the restaurant the day before that was just blown up today, especially if you went shopping in the Dizengoff shopping center that was blown up the next day, especially if the discotheque underneath your hotel was blown up, killing dozens of the young people that you saw every day when you left the hotel and you saw them lining up to go into that discotheque. When buses blow up, killing civilians, when this happens every time you visit, this has an influence on you as well. And so I was extraordinarily sympathetic to the Israeli cause, the Israeli plight, and never once took the time to study the Palestinian side of the story, because I allowed the Palestinian narrative to be painted as a Hamas-based narrative, one of terror. And again, I'm also an American who grew up with images of the Palestinian Liberation Organization hijacking airplanes and blowing up on the Jordanian deserts, PLO activists or people affiliated with the PLO coming in, taking over schools and having, so the whole concept of the Palestinians as terrorists, it existed in my head. It's very hard to get that out. It took Israel behaving in an outrageous fashion after October 7th to finally get me to break that paradigm, to sit there and say, there's just something wrong here. And then you listen, imagine that, listening to the Palestinian position and saying, as opposed to rejecting it out of hand, saying, you're Palestinians, you're terrorists, you're horrible, to sit down and say, something's wrong here, so I'm going to listen to what you have to say. And then hearing what they have to say, and then going and doing some basic research. And it's amazing how quickly, you don't have to dig deep. I'm a professional researcher. I've said this before, footnotes are my best friend and my worst enemy, because when I get a book, I read the footnotes. And that's always a good thing to do. But the problem is I'm not satisfied with I got to get the book that's footnoted. And then, because I need to get to the basic bottom line here, I need to get to the original source material. I'm not going to accept somebody's interpretation of what happened. So I end up buying books. My wife's like, why? But the answer is because I want to know the truth. And so this is how I operate on the Palestinian issue. I have a lot left to learn. I'll be the first one to admit that. You can't learn about this in a few short I mean, since what, 19 months now, but I'm learning. And what I've learned is that the Palestinians aren't perfect, far from it. The Palestinian cause is diverse, is a very kind way of putting it. It's fractured. When you speak of the Palestinians, who are we speaking of? Hamas? Are we speaking of Islamic Jihad? Are we speaking of the Palestinian Authority? Who is the head of, who speaks for the people of Palestine? Does Abu Mazen, Mohammed Abbas speak for them, or does the head of Hamas speak for them, or whom? It's a very complicated topic to try and delve into. So I have to work through this layers of politics and get down to the basic Palestinian person, the human being on the ground, who is a prisoner of politics, but just wants to live. And they need the dignity of life. They need the dignity of sovereignty. They need the dignity of freedom. All the things that we as human beings demand. Professor Marandi has said that the Iranian people demand dignity. Well, they earned it. They're a sovereign people. Americans demand dignity. We've earned it. We're a sovereign people. Palestinians demand dignity. They've earned it. But they're not a sovereign people. They're not being allowed to be a sovereign people. And so this lady misses out on everything. This what she calls a proxy conflict is just it's a lack of intellectual capacity on her part. It's a grossly oversimplified approach to a very complex problem. And it's one that is not founded in any basis of human dignity or morality. She is advocating murder. Straight up. She's trying to disguise it in political terms and justify it. And, whenever somebody leads with their argument, this is in the national interest. Well, hell's bells. So was the Holocaust. The Germans, the Nazis articulate that the Holocaust was in the national security interest of Germany. Hell, killing all the Slavs in Russia was in the national security interest of Germany. Killing homosexuals and Catholics, anybody who opposed the Third Reich, it was in the national security. So a lot of crime, a lot of criminal activity is done in the national security interest of a state. Let's forget about national security interests and let's talk about how national policies affect basic humanity. And the policies of Israel are so far divergent from any respect towards the humanity of the Palestinians that it's stunning. And the fact that the British, home of the Magna Carta, are behaving in this fashion. And I won't say what I want to say, but because it'll open up another. I don't need to bring this down on Nima's head, but who the hell is she to speak on behalf of England and British traditions and British history and all that stuff? I would imagine she should do a better job of the nation that she's calling her home, and maybe not be so susceptible to being used by political powers, political forces that have been using people for generations. And she's just yet another person being used by these powers, and they will throw her away the second she wakes up. But no, this is bad. But it happens in the United States. We see this in the United States. I'm in the center of a huge controversy now because I'm trying to create a bridge with Zionists to talk about how we can resolve this issue, to break free of the paradigm of condemnation and criticism and hatred and say, okay, you don't agree with me and I don't agree with you, but what can we do to bring this inhuman system, this inhuman situation to an end? I mean, that's what matters. If you say you're a human, then you have to care about humanity. You can't tolerate another video of a little girl running in a burning building while her family burns to death behind her. I don't give a damn who you are and what you believe in. That cannot be allowed to happen. And it happens on a daily basis in Gaza today. And where is the humanity? Where is the humanity? There is no humanity today. Not in the West, not in the collective West. We have failed ourselves unless we no longer want to call ourselves human beings. And then in case it just doesn't matter. But I am a human being. I do care about humanity, and I condemn every word out of that woman's mouth.
Professor Marandi, your take.
Well, first, she said something which I think also was misinformation or disinformation. And I think if we assume that she's being honest, it just shows how narrative building works. At least one of the two people who were killed in Washington was a Christian, and so he was neither a Semite nor a Jew. Of course, most Jews or at least the European Jews in Palestine are not Semites, but the Palestinians are Semites. But that aside, it just shows that either she's being dishonest or she's twisting the truth in order to promote a particular narrative, or it also shows how these senior officials, they are surrounded by people who feed them with these narratives. But the most disturbing part of all, of course, was when she spoke about proxy wars. She basically admitted what the Russians have been saying all along about Ukraine, that it's a proxy war. And and it's very disappointing, by the way, particularly disappointing when a woman of color speaks this way about Palestine and all that. But I think we all saw that. Just stating the obvious. But so she's saying the truth out loud. But when it comes to Palestine, it's particularly sickening because the images that Scott is speaking about are still fresh in our minds. And it's not the first time, of course. It's happened many times. And many of these airstrikes where you see these cars burning up in flames or buildings, that the people are burnt alive inside. But for her to speak like this about the Palestinian people and to, people who, their resistance began before the revolution in Iran. The resistance began before Hamas existed. The revolution in Iran, yes, strengthened the resistance in Palestine, and it didn't just support Hamas, it supported all of the groups, secular and religious. But the plight of the Palestinian people began before the revolution, it began before Hamas, it began before Islamic Jihad, it began before Hezbollah. She's talking total nonsense. Either she doesn't know this, which is damning in its own way, or she does, and it's also damning. But what I think is most important is that what Scott said about his own personal trajectory reminds me of what I've read about the Vietnam War. And that is that early on when the war began, when the Americans took over from the French and they became the dominant force there, overwhelmingly, Americans supported the war effort. They saw this as the right thing to do. And people like, for example, we know about Muhammad Ali and his story. He was hated. He later on became a hero among Americans, black and white. But back then he was despised. I don't know how he was viewed among African Americans, like what percentage it was, but in general among the bulk of American society, which was of course predominantly white, but still he was despised. As the war moved forward and more body bags came in, because back then it was a conscript army, so everyone had to go. It's not like now where you just a certain class of people go and ordinary Americans are not threatened by death and destruction in these overseas occupations. Back then everyone had to go. So increasingly people were getting curious because you had body bags coming in and people started reading. People started doing research. They started learning about Ho Chi Minh and the history of Vietnam. And that's where the anti-war movement grew. And by the time the war came to an end, I'm not saying the majority of Americans were anti-war. I don't know the exact numbers right now because ultimately, Nixon won the election. But the anti-war movement was becoming so powerful that the elites could no longer ignore it. It was becoming a danger to the United States. And if the war continued, probably it would have had huge consequences for the political establishment, far greater than what we saw. catastrophic mistake for the Zionist regime, for this ethno-supremacist colonial regime, is that they let this genocide go on. Netanyahu, I believe this from the beginning, his number one motive has always been Netanyahu. What motivates him is his own selfish interests, his own political survival. I don't think that he cares about Israel, about the regime, nearly as much as he cares about himself, because what he did is not in the interest of this sinister regime. He could have ended this genocide after 2 months. Most people, I think, across the world would have believed the lies about rape and the beheadings, October the 7th and that narrative. And they would have believed sort of the story that it all began on October the 7th, what Scott was talking. But the longer this lasted, the more we saw these images online, the more people began to ask questions. And so people came out of their ignorance. And even in the United States, where it's the most propagated people in the world, we saw how people were seeing the truth. That's why they banned TikTok and so on. And that's why social media is banning Palestinians. People are going to jail. People are getting kicked out of their jobs, out of universities, across the West and in the United States, because it's having an impact, because it's having a huge impact. So Netanyahu, by pushing for this, to continue this war and expanding it, carrying out genocidal attacks in Lebanon, attacking Iran, destroying Syria, in coordination with with the United States, with Erdogan in the case of Syria. These are all overstretching Israel. They're all making it look barbaric. It's not just about Palestine, it's about the whole region. They're killing people in multiple countries. It makes, every day that this continues, it makes it look worse and worse and worse for Israel. And that's why, in the eyes of so many people across the world, they've lost their legitimacy. I don't come to Venezuela and argue about Israel. They know it better than me. The young people, when they talk, they're as Scott put it, they're better at their footnotes than I am. They can tell me, yeah, like so-and-so happened too. I'll say, oh yeah, you're right. When I go to China, the same. When I go to Russia, the same. Wherever I travel, 3-4 years ago, I had to argue with colleagues, sometimes in Iran, often in Iran, about the nature of the regime. And I had to, convince people that, the Israeli regime was sinister or whatever. Now, it's just, they say it a lot better than I do. Young people who I meet, much better, much more sophisticated, much smarter than me, much more eloquent. I often feel like I'm just wasting people's time. They've brought it upon themselves. So the trajectory that Scott speaks about is something, it's universal. We're all seeing the world in even the way I view the world. When I look at Russia today, when I look at China, when I look at the region, I see it differently from from 2 years ago. Because the way in which the Americans and the Europeans have conducted themselves, and this deputy head of the Conservative Party in the UK, the way in which they conduct themselves, make me rethink everything. Because even I myself, I'm sort of, Euros in a way, orientalized, because we still looked at the West and Western media and like how they see themselves as exceptional and democratic but ultimately I've seen that the worst enemies of human rights are actually in the West. And of course, those who resist them, Jews, Christians, Muslims, the youth, older people in the West, they are heroes. But the political regimes in the West, in my view, are the most immoral. When I look at Russia, I think Russia's not doing this. China's not doing this. There's this, whenever they used to always speak about how the Chinese are abusing Muslims. Well, everyone in China has smartphones. I mean, if they're slaughtering people in China like they're doing in Palestine, we'd see a lot of footage. I'm not saying China is some utopia. I'm not saying Russia is a utopia. I'm not saying Iran is a utopia. But what the Zionist regime has done, what Netanyahu has done, and it's not just Netanyahu. I mean, because some in the West are trying to scapegoat him, as if like Hitler, Germany without Nazi Germany without Hitler is okay. But what Netanyahu has done, and what his ruling coalition has done, and of course overwhelmingly what Zionists have done, because we see the polls, how they support ethnic cleansing, how they support mass slaughter, liberals and religious Zionists. And of course, Zionism is not Judaism. Again, we've seen the heroism of Jews across the board at the forefront of the resistance against Zionism. That we always have to repeat. They played a heroic role, and they're growing in number. And many, many, many young Jews are involved in this resistance. But in any case, what he's done and what the Israeli regime has done is it has woken people across the world. And some say, well, public opinion shifts and people. This is very different. This is not some football match. This is not some small crime. This has been going on for almost 20 months now, and it will probably continue. And the damage that it does to the West is that not only does it destroy its image, but it destroys its ability to even negotiate even key issues. Witkoff goes on one day, he has a ceasefire. The next day, Trump undermines it. Then we hear that Witkoff gives a proposal to Hamas. Hamas accepts it. Israel rejects it. Just the other day, just less than 48 hours ago. And then Witkoff goes and says, no, Hamas rejected it. Reminds me of what happened under Biden. We had the same thing. Hamas, the resistance, accepted the ceasefire proposal. Israel rejected it, and Biden and crew and the U.S. Secretary of State said, no, Hamas rejects it. It just, what this is doing is poison for even U.S. so-called national interests, even the interests of the West, whatever they may be, whether legitimate or otherwise. So I think that each day that, and I hope it ends now, but each day that this genocide goes by, the Israeli regime is growing weaker and weaker. And have no doubt that even though all of the regimes in this region, all of the governments are complicit as much as Europe. Turkey, the Turkish government, the Emirati government, the Qatari government, all of them are in bed with the enemy. And only the most racist or sectarian people close their eyes to this reality. But have no doubt that Iran will continue to support the Palestinians. They will continue to support Hamas. They will continue to support Ansar Allah and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah. And the resistance, the axis of resistance is not going away. And ultimately, I have no doubt that despite all the pain and suffering, and sometimes it's just, you get exhausted. The footage that Scott is alluding to, this young girl, really, it was one of the worst mornings of my life. I was here when I woke up in the early morning here, and I saw this, and I couldn't go back to sleep, and it was sickening. But even when you're tired and you just want to hide and just go away, that's when you have to keep pushing. We all have to keep pushing. Imagine how exhausted people in Gaza are. We don't have the luxury to be exhausted and to have a rest. We have to all be active 24 hours a day. We have to push and push and push and continue to help people, to wake people up, those who are still asleep. There still are those who are asleep, and ultimately bring an end to this regime, and to have a Palestine where Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all the same. They're all Amalek. They're all just human beings, ordinary human beings. And where this young girl, she can grow up alongside a Jewish kid, a Christian kid and live like people do in other parts of the world.
Let me just say, I'm a firefighter, and when I saw that image, it sickened me because I'm fully aware of radiant heat and how hot that could be. And I just assumed she died, but then I found out that she actually was rescued and she lived. And but then the price she paid in terms of her family members who are, I guess her father survived and he's badly injured, but everybody else is dead. She would be a better person than me if she could grow up and live in peace and harmony with a Jewish child her age. This sort of thing is conducive to teaching hate. And just to talk about the Vietnam War, just a personal experience real quick. My father was deployed to Vietnam for a year in 1965, 1966, part of 10th Fighter Commando, the Jungle Gym program. And he was a believer, true believer in the Vietnam War. Thought America was doing the right thing. Thought we were there for the benefit of the South Vietnamese people. And I grew up at that time, and I watched their trajectory. I remember when my uncle volunteered and deployed to Vietnam in 1970, and he ended up invading Cambodia. And I remember the confusion that caused amongst my parents. And for the first time hearing debate at the dinner table about, remember my dad's active duty Air Force at this time, and hearing debate at the dinner table, what are we doing? What is, what's going on? Why are we doing this? And then in 1974, 75, my father was involved in the Vietnamization program, that is going to Vietnam and doing the transition. And he came back and he said, it's all a lie. Everything we're doing is a lie. Everything I did was a lie. And that was there. And this was devastating for him, an active duty officer, to come to the realization that everything he did in Vietnam was a lie, that it wasn't a just cause from the start. And then I'll just say one thing about, war is an extension of politics by other means. And this is a very controversial statement I'm going to make, but it builds upon what you said. I don't think it's an accident that Israel has committed suicide in terms of public opinion around the world. Hamas, Sinwar, knew Israelis better than Israelis knew them themselves, having been a prisoner of Israel. He studied them, he wrote about them. And Hamas knew darn well, based upon their own experience, how Israel behaves when hostages are taken. They understood the mowing the grass, the Daiwa doctrine of collective punishment. I think one of the strategic geniuses of Hamas on October 7th was to create a situation where the Israelis committed suicide. But in order to commit suicide, they had to commit the most horrific crimes. That what Hamas did is empower Israel to be Israel in a manner that the world could not ignore. Because that's the only way you break the grip that Israel has on American public opinion, on European public opinion, on global public opinion. People need to remember that prior to October 7th, Israel was in the midst of being rehabilitated under the Abrams Accords and under the Biden India, Middle East, European economic corridor that was going to normalize relations between Israel and their Gulf Arab states and absolutely be devastating to the prospects of statehood for Palestine. And today, all of that is gone. Israel is destroyed in terms of reputation. It's been rightly labeled as a genocidal state. Its military cannot be, under any serious discussion, described as the most moral military in the world. And what they are doing is committing genocide on a daily basis. And the world sees the truth about Israel. And this is the strategic victory of Hamas. I know people don't want to link the two, but I think Hamas knew exactly what it was doing and knew exactly what the price they were going to pay in doing. It's just, I've used this analogy in the past, and I think it's apt. For the Allies to go across the beach at Normandy and begin the liberation of Paris or of France, they would have to carry out a number of supporting military actions, strategic bombing, etc. And they briefed Charles de Gaulle, the head of the Free French forces, that to liberate Normandy, we will have to kill maybe 60, 80,000 French civilians, innocents. And de Gaulle signed off on it. Now, we ended up only killing 20 to 30,000, but that's a horrific number. And de Gaulle could never attend a a D-Day anniversary after that because of the sickening reality of what he had to sign off on in order to liberate France from Nazi occupation. I wish Sinwar was alive, and I wish I had the opportunity to interview him, because I would ask him this question about his strategic intent in carrying out October 7th the way he did. Humiliating Israel like Israel has never been humiliated before, taking hundreds of hostages, bringing them back to Gaza, compelling Israel to move into Gaza, knowing how Israel behaves. In my mind, this was a deliberate action on the part of Hamas to trigger events that would expose the evil nature of the Israeli regime to the world. And what we're seeing today in the world turning their backs on Israel, recognizing Israel for what they are, this genocidal state ruled by maniacs, is a victory for Hamas. It's a moral victory for Hamas, but Hamas had to pay, and the Palestinian people had to pay a horrific cost to get them down this path.
Thank you so much.
Before, if you're going to go, though, I just want to bounce something off Professor Marandi, make a little news here, maybe. Because we started off saying we don't know what the heck's going on with this meeting in Russia.
Yeah.
You know, why would United Arab Emirates, North Korea, and Iran come together in Russia? So I want to put out a possibility and see what Professor Marandi thinks of it. In 2008, I traveled to Abu Dhabi, part of a NATO conference, but I had also went there for the purpose of talking to a very senior member of the Abu Dhabi royal family about Iran and Iran's nuclear program. Because at that time, Abu Dhabi was putting forward its own nuclear program. And Iran had made a suggestion about a nuclear fuel bank as a way of resolving this issue. And I broached it to him in person, and we had a very lengthy conversation about this. And he said he would think about it. But before I left the next day, they came back and he said, unfortunately, under no circumstances would we ever work with Iran on an issue of this nature. But I bring it up because I've heard whispers that Iran is once again talking about the possibility of a nuclear fuel bank. I also hear that the Trump administration has engaged the Russians about the denuclearization of North Korea. And so when I hear all this, I say, wait a minute, what if Russia is holding a meeting to bring the Iranians, the United Arab Emirates, and the North Koreans together to discuss the possibility of a nuclear fuel bank that would lend itself to an overall policy of nuclear nonproliferation? I just wanted to see what Dr. Marandi thought about that crazy idea.
I have heard them talk about this sort of thing, but I have no doubt that Iran won't give up the cycle inside Iran, and that Iran won't accept a scenario where they do not have nuclear enrichment in Iran. Maybe for, let's say, and I'm just speculating, just because you asked, but maybe for, let's say, mass production, and in order to fuel the nuclear power plants, such a thing could be done. But I think for the reasons which I explained early on, that Iran feels the need that it has to be independent or be able to remain independent in case the Americans try to strangle the country or to prevent it from obtaining its own fuel. I think because of that, Iran won't give up enrichment itself.
Right. No, I agree with that. But one of the problems of the American formulation, Iran has developed very expansive enrichment capabilities that are well beyond its current need for nuclear power. But Iran has also said that they are resistant to being asked to reduce its enrichment capacity. So what if Iran was able to keep its enrichment capacity in Iran, but instead make the production as part of a fuel bank that supported, North Korean nuclear power, United Arab Emirates nuclear power, and that served as a model to support other. So Iran would keep the enrichment capability in Iran, but that it would be part of a international consortium so to speak, that would give legitimacy to Iran's expansive and it's just an idea. It bounced in my little simplistic Marine Corps mind, but
wow.
No.
Well, if your little simplistic, if your mind is little and simplistic, then I think the Marines are very much underrated. I really don't know. I
don't know either. I'm trying to brainstorm.
All I can say is I'm sure that they'll keep the nuclear cycle and they'll continue enriching uranium, but I think that they will be looking. I mean, when the Saudi defense minister of defense came to Tehran, the leader said, "We are prepared to give you our technological capabilities," and it was widely interpreted in Iran as Iran will help the Saudis develop their own nuclear fuel cycle. So I think that that is you could interpret that as being a part of the Iranian attempt, or to show neighbors and regional countries that it wants to be even more friendly, and it wants to bring them closer to Iran and separate them, divide them, distance them from the United States as much as possible. And this sort of idea is something that could possibly be developed in a way in which it would create greater convergence among countries in the region and beyond. But I don't know, how, if this is a real. I don't even know if this meeting is going to happen, or what it's about, or if it's about Iran or about nuclear energy. I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't either. I'm just trying to figure out what possible to bring these four countries together. And anyway, thank you for.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Idea.
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi and Scott. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks.
Bye, Scott.
Bye-bye.